Thinking about aha moments, here's another stunner for me. Also a stunner for researchers, that if you are a committed church-going man, the statistics for being anything but toxic are humongous. But if you're just a nominal Christian man, wow, you actually fit the stereotype of toxic masculinity.
Yes, this was amazing. And it really is the final reason I decided to write the book, when I saw the positive outcomes of committed Christian men. So this is material that's not really out in the public. I had to go digging into these academic literature to find these studies. So I cite about a dozen studies showing that committed Christian men actually test out as the most loving and engaged husbands and fathers. Let me preface that by saying this is very much counter to the cultural narrative. In writing the book, a quick Google search found lots and lots of quotes saying that evangelical men who believe in any form of male headship are, of course, going to turn out to be oppressive, domineering, tyrannical patriarchs. I'll give you just one quote. So this was the co-founder of the Church Too movement, which followed the Me Too movement. She said, "The theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today."
Today, Hank is talking to best-selling author Nancy R. Pearcey. She's talking about her new book, The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. And this is an essential book to equip all Christians to challenge politically correct ideology and bring an evidence-based message of healing into the public square. So get this book very easily. Just click that I in the upper right-hand corner. You will see a link for the book right below the description of this video. You know, there's a trending hashtag on social media, and it says, #KillAllMen. So how did an ideology arise that condemns masculinity as dangerous and destructive? Of course, we often hear that exhibit A of toxic behavior is evangelical Christian men. But the social sciences tell a very different story. Studies find that men who attend church regularly test out as the most loving husbands and the most engaged fathers. And Nancy goes through all these sociological facts that basically explode the anti-male stereotypes, and particularly she shows that Christianity has the power to overcome actual toxic behavior and reconciles the sexes. So again, click that I in the upper right-hand corner for a link to this book, and you'll find it below the video description. Now back to the conversation with Hank and Nancy.
So what happened is the psychologists, sociologists were reading these accusations and saying, well, where's your evidence? You know, you're making these charges, where's your data? And so they went and did the studies, and they found that, as you said, committed, authentic Christian men who attend church regularly test out as the most loving husbands and fathers. And by the way, the first pushback I always get is, well, of course their wives said they were happy. The husbands are sitting right next to them. So you have to clarify, no, these are very large population-wide studies, not done by Christian organizations. There's secular people and Islamic and Jewish, these are very large, thousands of people done by secular organizations, like the General Social Survey, for example. And then various researchers will come and take what they are interested out of that data. And so most of the studies were not Christians running them, and the wives were interviewed separately. At any rate, so what they're reporting is that the wives say that they are the happiest with their husband's expression of love and affection. Evangelical fathers are the most engaged with their children, both in terms of shared activities like sports and church youth group, and in terms of discipline, like setting limits on screen time and enforcing bedtime, 3.5 hours per week more than the average American father. Evangelical couples are the least likely to divorce, and they have the lowest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any major group in America. And when I read this, I was blown away. I had no idea. I was reading the critics like all of us were. And I said, I've got to get this out. I have to get this out into the public. The church needs to know this because the church needs to understand that men who are committed Christians are doing a good job. They need to stop having that scolding tone that I talked about earlier and start affirming and supporting men and letting them know that they're doing a good job. But the other side of the coin, as you mentioned, is nominal Christians. So nominal means in name only. My students don't even know what the term means, so I have to explain to them. Nominal Christians, the one of the most widely quoted statistics among Christian leaders, as you no doubt know, is that Christians divorce at the same rate as the rest of the culture. So the researchers went back to the data, and they did make that crucial distinction between committed Christians and nominal Christians. And as you said, the nominal Christians are shockingly different. They do fit all the toxic stereotypes. Their wives report the lowest level of happiness. They report the lowest level of engagement with their children. They have the highest rate of divorce, higher than secular men. And they have the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence, even higher than secular men. So this is why the statistics get so skewed. Because you have men who are better than secular men and men who are worse than secular men. So if you just do a broad-based discussion of evangelicals, of course, the numbers are going to be misleading. And it does suggest, again, what the church needs to do. Support the men who are doing a good job. Be aware that they are. Encourage them. They feel as beaten down as any other men do. But also, I think we need better programs to reach out to these men who are kind of at the fringes of the Christian world, who are claiming the identity of evangelical, and who we might say are ruining the reputation of evangelicals, because they're taking biblical language like headship and submission, but infusing it with meaning from the secular script for masculinity, infusing it with definitions like dominance, entitlement, control, and so on. And I sometimes have people ask me, well, but why are they worse than secular men if they're taking their definitions from the secular world? Well, it's because they're feeling like they have religious permission to act that way, right? So the secular person can be an abusive husband, say, but he doesn't have religious justification. The nominal Christian feels he has religious permission to act that way. And so he ends up actually having the worst of both worlds and being worse than secular men. So that's what we're up against in the church. We have the best and the worst, and we have to figure out a good strategy for dealing with men within the church.
Yeah, what you do in the book, and in chapter 3, titled "The Paradox of Christian Marriage," what Christians really think about headship. You just alluded to this, but elaborate on that, because there's such a stereotypical narrative about what headship actually entails. It's completely divorced from the real biblical understanding or the Christian understanding of headship.
Yes, I was surprised again, because this is all coming out of, hard data, empirical research, rigorous testing. I don't know if you know this, but when my book first appeared, like the day after the book appeared, it was viciously attacked by Christian egalitarians. I don't know, if you're not on Twitter, you may not have noticed this. They took over my whole Twitter page for days, for weeks. And this was interesting because I don't even debate the egalitarian complementarian issue in my book. I don't, because I'm not interested in these in-house debates. Well, there's two reasons. One is two of my top researchers say that in practice, it doesn't seem to make much difference. This was fascinating. So Brad Wilcox is considered, he's at the University of Virginia. He's considered like the top marriage sociologist in the country. And his conclusion from his research was, I've tested men who are egalitarian, and I've tested men who are complementarian. And he said, complementarian men are not abusive. They do test out as the happiest, they're most engaged, loving husbands and fathers. By the way, he's Catholic. So in a sense, he didn't have a dog in this fight, because I don't know that he was happy to find out that evangelical Protestant men test out on top at the highest level. And he tested egalitarian marriages, and he said, they're not any happier. They don't test out as happier. And then there's a top marriage psychologist in the country, John Gottman. And he said the same thing. He said, I have people coming into my practice. Some of them believe the man should be in charge of his marriage. And I have people come in who are very egalitarian. And he said, here's how he put it. Emotionally intelligent husbands have figured out the most important thing, which is how to convey honor and respect to your wife. Their gender theory does not seem to make a difference. So I just quoted that and said, okay, this is why I'm not going to deal with this question in my book. And then the first several weeks the book was out, the book got dragged into that debate by Christian egalitarians. The second reason that I don't do it is because I'm an apologist, right? So I want to counter the secular charges. The secular world says, if you are an evangelical conservative Christian, you will be a domineering, abusive patriarch. And so I thought, well, let's find out. Let's look at these studies that were done of evangelical men. What do they say? And so chapter 3 is pretty much all just quotes from Christian men and women saying what they think headship means. And once again, I was blown away by how loving and respectful their understanding of headship was. They did not define it primarily in terms of breadwinner or final authority or tiebreaker, some of the things we normally hear. They defined the most common phrase was spiritual leadership, spiritual leader. And if you press them, well, what do you mean by that? They would start with the most obvious practical things. Get your family to church on Sunday, get your kids to youth group, have family devotions, have family prayers. But it also was the less tangible things like being responsible for the spiritual life and welfare of your wife and children. And so I quoted a secular sociologist saying, wait a minute, how can you believe in headship and equal worth at the same time? Well, Christians have figured out how to do that. Yes, there's a headship in terms of a special kind of responsibility for the husband, but they don't think that means that husband and wife have differing worth, that women are inferior or subordinate. They do believe that they're both made in God's image and clearly have the same spiritual status. So chapter 3 is just quoting Christian couples, showing what they think headship means. And I personally, I didn't expect it to be that positive. It was very, very positive.
Yeah, it's about responsibility, not privilege.
Yeah, nice. That was a nice summary.
Yeah, so you say that Christian marriage was historically revolutionary, and then you expand on that in the book, and I think that is very eye-opening for our audience to hear. It's hard for people to go back, let's say, to first century Rome and see how women were treated within that context and how Christianity comes into that context and liberates women, exalts women. Obviously, Christ is the quintessential example of taking women and giving women significant roles. I mean, they're his entourage. They're part of his inner circle. Mary is the quintessence of theosis. I mean, she's everything that we hope to be. So marriage from a Christian standpoint was revolutionary to the culture. It was countercultural.
Yeah, it's difficult for us to make this point with our secular friends because Christianity has become the wallpaper, right? They don't realize how much our views of women and the value, dignity, significance of women has come from Christianity. So you get that perspective better if you go back to the first century. And what was the early church facing? Well, in Roman culture, women had very little status, very little value. Women were expected, marriage was to produce legal heirs, but there was not any expectation that there would be any real love and affection between husband and wife. Women were often married off at age 12 or 13. So they were much younger than their husbands. They had much less education. And it was almost more like marrying a child, right? As a result, men and women or husbands and wives had very little in common, and women were seen as inferior. Well, because they were so much younger. It was totally socially acceptable for men to have sex with just about anybody, prostitutes, courtesans, mistresses, and most of all, their slaves. Slaves were the most common, both male and female, both adult and children. Pedophilia was a big part of it. And in fact, as you know, unwanted children were often put out. It was called exposed. They were exposed. They were put out to be, killed by the wild beast or by the elements. Those children are sometimes rescued and raised in brothels to be sex slaves.
Today, Hank is talking to best-selling author Nancy R. Pearcey. She's talking about her new book, The Toxic War in Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. And this is an essential book to equip all Christians to challenge politically correct ideology and bring an evidence-based message of healing into the public square. So get this book very easily. Just click that I in the upper right-hand corner. You will see a link for the book right below the description of this video. There's a trending hashtag on social media, and it says, #KillAllMen. So how did an ideology arise that condemns masculinity as dangerous and destructive? Of course, we often hear that exhibit A of toxic behavior is evangelical Christian men. But the social sciences tell a very different story. Studies find that men who attend church regularly test out as the most loving husbands and the most engaged fathers. And Nancy goes through all these sociological facts that basically explode the anti-male stereotypes, and particularly, she shows that Christianity has the power to overcome actual toxic behavior and reconciles the sexes. So again, click that I in the upper right-hand corner for a link to this book, and you'll find it below the video description. Now back to the conversation with Hank and Nancy.
So in this context, and abortion, I should say, abortion and infanticide were committed primarily against baby girls. It was rare. Historians tell us it was rare for a Roman family to have more than one daughter. They would have a token girl, but that was it. Any more girls would be, again, killed or aborted. And abortion was a big killer of women too. If you insisted, there were some famous cases of people who insisted that they'd had sex outside of marriage, and so they insisted that the woman have an abortion. And abortion was a big killer of women at that time. So all that to say that when Christianity came on the scene and said, you need to be faithful in marriage, that was not a huge message for women, but it was revolutionary for men. Men were like shocked. What do you mean? We can't have sex outside of marriage? You find Augustine in the 4th century, 300s, still admonishing Christian men that they should not have sex with their slaves. So we don't usually hear that. But even in the church, it was a difficult message for men to accept. It took several centuries. So sometimes that kind of historical perspective helps us to recognize that Christianity applied the same moral standard to men as to a sexual standard, fidelity in marriage, chastity outside of marriage, to both men and women. And that was shocking at the time. In fact, I even quote a sermon from Augustine where he says, if a man, he's addressing the man who's having sex with his slaves. And he's saying, your wife is going to tell you that's wrong. The wife is going to tell you, look, we heard at church that this was wrong and you need to stop. So yes, it was something that was even difficult for Christians to adopt. Now we take it for granted. We take so much of our Christianity for granted. It's become so endemic to our culture, but that's a big one. It was harder for men than for women. And I think that's what we need to understand. The Christian ethic demands a lot from men. It demands that they, like you said a moment ago, it's responsibility, a level of responsibility that they just don't face in the secular world.
So no small wonder that women were attracted to Christianity.
Good. Yes, that is the conclusion I draw. Exactly. Women were very much drawn to the early church. From the beginning, there were more women than men in the Christian church. Who was it? One of the church fathers, I think it may have been Augustine, was saying, we have so many young women in the church, we don't have enough young men for them to marry. And even outsiders, outside critics commented on how, well, they would say it in a disparaging sense, right? Oh, Christianity, this new cult here, it's primarily for women because there were so many women in the church. But today we think being against abortion, for example, is anti-women. At that time, they understood very well that being against abortion was pro-woman, that it showed respect for women in their reproductive capacities. And of course, as I said, many women were killed by abortion as well. The fact that it was against, that the Christian church stood against adultery and fornication, women loved it because it was saying to them, you man, your husband has to be focused on you. You don't have to share him with prostitutes and courtesans and mistresses and boys. By the way, I have a quote from a Roman poet who admonished Roman women that sex with boys was more pleasurable than sex with their wives. So stop complaining, is what he said, basically. There was even, we have questions that are common in public discourse, like debates. We have debates over immigration, right? Or we have debates over now COVID mandates or whatever. They had debates over, is sex with women better than sex with men? Which means a large number of people were debating that no, sex with men is better, and especially sex with boys. So women, wives were sharing their husbands not only with other women, but also with men and boys. When the gospel says to them, no men, you have to put all of your erotic energy, all your love and affection, all your faithfulness on your wife. You have to invest your marriage with that kind of intensity. Had a huge impact on raising the status of women and of marriage.
We have just scratched the surface on aha moments, as I'd like to call them. But part 2 of the book, How the Secular Script Turned Toxic. I want to read 2 quotes from that section. It's actually in chapter 4, titled Pioneers and Puritans. A lot of great stuff to cover here. But anyway, the 2 quotes. Regarding women in business, Donald Trump said, I hate to tell you, men, generally speaking, women are better than you are. Barack Obama, on the other side of the political divide, said to women in politics, you're better than us. I'm absolutely confident that for 2 years, if every nation on earth was run by women, you'd see a significant improvement across the board on just about everything. And I read those statements because they're indicative of a narrative that has been cast out of ignorance, a narrative that has taken, for example, the Puritans, as you point out, and recast them completely in terms of fact and fiction.
Yes, I have to tell you, even teaching at a Christian university, I have had several students say to me, I never heard anything good about the Puritans until I read your book. So I'm up against a huge barrier as I try to help people understand. No, the Puritans actually had a very high view of marriage. If you read their original literature, their letters to one another, for example, are very affectionate. And use affectionate language with one another, very loving. They argued that spiritually women are equal. They actually used language like equality. And they said, oh, sure, in human culture and customs, of when men and women are treated separately. But in what really matters, which is the spiritual world, men and women are equal before God. And this was a new one for me. Did you know that the first law against wife beating passed anywhere that we know of in the world was the Puritans. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, 1641, passed the first law ever against wife beating. It was soon followed by a law against husband beating, and then a law against beating children and servants. But that gives you some clue to where the Puritans were, that they actually did have a very high view of women and the cultural narrative that we've heard. What was interesting about this is that even my secular historians, as you probably know, if you've looked at the endnotes, most of my historians are secular people. And one of them is a very well-known feminist historian. And she was shocked. She said that she was shocked by what she found out about the Puritans. And for just to give one example, she said, every treatise on a household structure gave wives the permission to rebuke the patriarch, to rebuke their husbands if the husbands were sinning. And she was stunned by that the Puritans thought, well, certainly women had the spiritual capacity to pass judgment on the husbands when the husbands were sinning. And I give a couple of quotes to show that she was right about that. But even my secular historians were blown away when they actually read the Puritan literature, the affection and love between husbands and wives among the Puritans.
Yeah, and so back to sort of those narrative statements by Trump and by Obama, opposite sides of the political spectrum, but saying essentially the same thing. It is, in essence, a demeaning of true masculinity.
Yes, so that has deep roots too. We can't really understand a social trend unless we say, where did it start from and how did it develop? And that has very deep roots. You have to go all the way back to the Industrial Revolution. Before that, men worked side by side with their wives and children all day in the family industry, the family farm, the family business. And so the masculine ethos, the cultural expectations for men was very much focused on the caretaking role. They're working with their children, wives and children all day. So of course they need to be gentle and patient. And they have responsibility for the household. In fact, that was the meaning of the term authority. That was a new one for me, by the way. You talk about your aha moments. My aha moments when I was doing the research, they had a very definite definition of authority. It meant the person in charge of the common good. Mm-hmm. In other words, I look out for what's good for me, you look out for what's good for you. But who looks out for the good of the whole, whether it's the marriage or the family, the church, the school, the society, whatever? That was what authority was for. The person in authority was not supposed to be looking out for his own interest. In fact, their favorite term was disinterested, meaning he was not to look out for his own interest because his job was to look out for the good of the whole. Well, where did we lose that? The Industrial Revolution was a key turning point because it took work out of the home. Men, of course, had to follow their work out of the home into factories and offices. And that's when you first start to see the literature change. People began to protest that men were losing that caretaking ethos that they had in the colonial era. That, working as an individual, they were becoming individualistic, becoming ambitious, aggressive, self-interested, look out for number one, make it to the top. And the literature of the day began to protest. They didn't like it. They didn't like what they were saying. But it was the first time that you begin to see the male character described in negative terms. And where do they get the quotes that you just had where, women are better? So this was part of the same development. As the public realm developed, it became also more secular. So as factories and industries developed and financial institutions and universities, and of course the state, they developed this large public sphere. And people began to say that these large public institutions should be run by scientific principles, by which they meant value-free. Just like today, when people say, don't bring your private values into the public arena. So, where in that case, first, so two things happened. First, men became more secular, right? They became more secular before women did, right? So, because they were getting that secular education, working in that secular sphere. And they tried sometimes to straddle the fence, right? They became the sacred secular split. They would operate by secular principles in the workplace and then come home and act as Christian men again. But that, of course, was untenable. But if values are kicked out of the public realm, where will they be cultivated? In the private realm. And who's responsible then? Well, women, because women were then in the private realm. And this is the first time ever in human history that women began to be seen as morally and spiritually superior, which is what you see in those quotes that you mentioned. Up until the 19th century, men were thought to be morally stronger. All the way back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, it was thought that the insight into right and wrong was a rational insight, and men were thought to be more rational, until men were thought to be more virtuous, stronger virtually. So, and by the way, even the word virtue comes from the Latin word for man. vir means man, as in the word virile. So the word virtue had overtones of masculine strength and honor. So up until the 19th century, there was a sudden switch where for the first time women were seen as morally superior. And men were supposed to come home from that dog-eat, competitive, rough and tumble world in the public square and come home and be reformed and refined and renewed by their morally superior wives. And women was said to be the moral guardians of society. And I think that double standard is what you see in those quotes that you mentioned at the beginning of this question. That somehow women are morally superior. If women were in charge, they would run things better. There wouldn't be war and conflict. It comes out of the 19th century when virtue was privatized and therefore seen as a more feminine quality for the first time.
Today, Hank is talking to best-selling author Nancy R. Pearcey. She's talking about her new book, The Toxic War in Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. And this is an essential book to equip all Christians to challenge politically correct ideology and bring an evidence-based message of healing into the public square. So get this book very easily. Just click that I in the upper right-hand corner. You will see a link for the book right below the description of this video. There's a trending hashtag on social media, and it says, #KillAllMen. So how did an ideology arise that condemns masculinity as dangerous and destructive? Of course, we often hear that exhibit A of toxic behavior is evangelical Christian men. But the social sciences tell a very different story. Studies find that men who attend church regularly test out as the most loving husbands and the most engaged fathers. And Nancy goes through all these sociological facts that basically explode the anti-male stereotypes. And particularly, she shows that Christianity has the power to overcome actual toxic behavior and reconciles the sexes. So again, click that I in the upper right-hand corner for a link to this book, and you'll find it below the video description.